The auctioneer's voice was a rhythmic, hypnotic drone, a sound as much a part of the Iowa landscape as the cicadas in August or the moan of the wind across a frozen cornfield in January. It was the summer of 1976, a hot one, the air thick with dust, and the sweet, cloying smell of diesel exhaust from the tractors idling at the edge of the lot. Men in seed corn caps stood in tight knots, their arms crossed, faces tanned and creased from years under the sun. They kicked tires, spat tobacco juice, and spoke in low tones about yields and rain, the two pillars upon which their world rested. I was there, standing off to the side, my hands shoved deep in the pockets of my worn denim jeans. My name is Jedediah Stone, though no one's called me that since my father passed. It's just Jed now. I was 26 years old, and I felt both ancient and impossibly young. I had my father's farm, 160 acres of good black dirt, free and clear. I also had his tools, his wisdom, and his deep-seated distrust of banks. In my front pocket, I had $583 in cash, the sum total of my liquid assets after setting aside money for taxes and seed. The auction was for the Miller place, a farm that had gone under. Old man Miller had tried to keep up, had taken out a loan for a new international harvester, 4TC66, and a 6-bottom plough, but his heart gave out before the first payment came due, and his kids, scattered to the cities, wanted nothing to do with the land or the debt. So here it all was, a life's work laid bare and sold off piece by piece. The big-ticket items went first. The 1466, barely a year old, its red paint still gleaming, started a bidding war between two guys from the next county. It was a beautiful machine, all horsepower and modern comfort, with an air-conditioned cab that looked like a cockpit. I watched it go for a price that could have bought my whole farm twice over, paid for with a checkbook and a handshake that smelled of bank loans. Then he showed up. Richard Peterson. Rich, they called him, and the name fit. He wasn't a farmer, not really. He was a land speculator who wore clean boots and drove a brand-new Ford F-250 that had never seen a speck of mud. His father, Howard Peterson, ran the county bank, the same bank that held the note on the Miller place and on half the other farms in a 50-mile radius. Rich strolled through the crowd like he owned it, a smug grin plastered on his face. He'd just taken delivery of a John Deere 7700 combine, the talk of the town. It was so big it had to be trucked in, a monument of green and yellow steel that represented the future of farming, or so he claimed. He saw me standing by the fence line and sauntered over. "Stone," he said, his voice dripping with condescension. "Picking up any spare parts for that museum you call a farm?" I just nodded. "Just watching, Rich." "You should be learning," he shot back. "This is how you get ahead. Leverage. You can't make money with cash, Jed. You gotta use the bank's money. My dad's always saying, you gotta spend money to make money." I didn't say anything. My father's words echoed in my head. "Debt is a chain, son. The man who holds the note holds your life." The auctioneer moved on to the older equipment, the stuff shoved to the back of the grove, relics from a bygone era. A rusty Farmall M, a John Deere Model B with one flat tire, and then they dragged it out with a loader. It was a Massey Ferguson 300 combine. It wasn't ancient like a pull type, but it was a good 15 years old, maybe more. The red paint was faded to a dull orange, streaked with long, weeping trails of rust. The grain head was bent on one side, where it had clearly hit a rock, and the tires were cracked and bulging like old varicose veins. A family of sparrows had built a nest in the unloading auger. It was a sad, forgotten thing. The auctioneer, a man named Dave, looked at it with pity. All right, boys, what do we bid for this classic piece of harvesting history? She's got a Perkins diesel, or what's left of one. Who'll give me $100 to start? 100? Do I hear 100? Silence. The men shuffled their feet. A few of them chuckled. Heck, Dave, someone yelled from the back. The scrap man might give you 50 for it. Rich Peterson laughed, a loud, braying sound. $50 and you'd have to deliver it. You'd spend more on fuel getting it there than it's worth. The crowd roared. I just stood there, looking at the machine. I saw the rust and the bent metal, but I saw something else too. I saw straight-cut gears, heavy steel, and a simple design. There wasn't a single computer chip or a complex hydraulic sensor on the whole thing. It was made of iron and grease, and common sense. It was fixable. All right, 50 it is, the auctioneer said, pointing at the man who'd shouted. I got 50, who'll give me 75? I raised my hand. Just a slight lift, not much. Dave's eyes found me. 75 from Jed Stone. Now we got an auction. Who'll make it 100? The man who'd bid 50 shook his head, laughing. He was out. The game was between me and the scrap yard. 100, another voice called. 125, I said, my own voice quiet but clear. We went back and forth in $25 increments. The crowd was watching now, a mix of amusement and pity on their faces. They were watching the town fool bid on the town joke. Rich Peterson was loving it. He stood with his arms crossed, that smirk never leaving his face. At $400, the other bidder dropped out. 400 once, Dave chanted. 400 twice. 500. A new voice boomed. It was Rich. He wasn't bidding to win. He was bidding to make me pay, to humiliate me. The crowd murmured. Now it was a spectacle. $500 from Mr. Peterson, Dave said, a new energy in his voice. Who'll go 5 1/4? I took a deep breath. I thought of the cash in my pocket. This was my line. 525, I said. Rich laughed out loud. Go ahead, Jed. It's all yours. Enjoy your lawn ornament. He turned to the men around him. Some people just don't know when to quit digging. Sold! Dave yelled, slamming his hand down. For $525 to Jed Stone. A wave of quiet whispers went through the crowd. I walked up to the clerk's table, pulled the worn bills from my pocket, counted them out, and got my receipt. I owned a 10,000-pound pile of rust. As I walked away, I heard Rich telling anyone who would listen, he'll never get that thing to run. Never. He just threw away $500 that could have been a down payment on a real piece of equipment. I ignored them. I walked over to my prize. I put my hand on the faded red fender, the metal hot from the afternoon sun. It felt solid. It felt real. Now, before I tell you what it took to get that old Massey off the Miller farm and back to my place, I have to ask you folks listening a question. Have you ever bought a piece of old iron that everyone else called junk? A tractor? A truck? A piece of equipment that was left for dead in a fence row? I want you to tell me about it down in the comments. What was it? And what did it take to bring her back to life? I'd sure like to read those stories. All right, let's get back to it. Getting the combine home was an ordeal that became a piece of local legend. I didn't have a lowboy trailer, and I certainly couldn't afford to hire one. All I had was my 1968 Chevy C50 grain truck with a PTO-driven winch on the front and a set of heavy chains. My plan was simple, which is often another word for stupid. I was going to tow it the 7 miles back to my farm. The first problem was the tires. All 4 were shot. I spent the rest of that afternoon and all of the next day with a rusty hand-cranked tire jack, a set of tire irons that had belonged to my grandfather, and a pile of patches. I broke the beads with a sledgehammer and a wedge, wrestled the petrified rubber off the rims, and patched the tubes. The air was filled with the smell of old rubber and the sound of my own cursing. I used my little gas-powered air compressor to fill them, and to my surprise, they held. They bulged and wobbled, but they held air. The next problem was the steering. It was seized solid from sitting. I spent hours underneath it, with a grease gun and a long pipe for leverage on the Zerk fittings, pumping grease into joints that hadn't seen any in a decade. I hammered on the tie rod ends with a brass drift until, with a groan of protesting metal, the steering wheel finally moved a few inches. It wasn't pretty, but it would have to do. By the third day, I was ready to pull it. I backed my Chevy up, hooked the chains to the combine's heavy front axle, and started the winch. The cable went taut, the truck's engine bogged down, and for a long moment, nothing happened. Then, with a sound like the world's biggest anchor being dragged across a rock bottom, the Massey lurched forward. Its brakes were seized, and I was dragging it, tires and all, through the dirt. Another half-day was lost, freeing the brakes, hammering on the drums until they finally broke loose with a shower of rust flakes. The 7-mile journey took the better part of 2 days. I couldn't go more than 3 miles an hour. Every time I hit a bump, the combine would sway and groan, threatening to break free. The whole county, it seemed, found a reason to drive down that particular stretch of gravel road. Cars slowed down, drivers pointed. I saw Rich Peterson's new Ford go by at least 3 times. The first time he just shook his head. The second time he laid on the horn and laughed as he passed. The third time, his father was with him in the passenger seat. The banker just stared at me, a look of utter disbelief on his face, as if I were some kind of primitive creature he was observing in the wild. When I finally pulled the hulking machine into my yard, I was covered in grease, sweat, and dirt. I was exhausted, but I felt a grim sense of satisfaction. The beast was home. I parked it next to the barn, the same barn my grandfather had raised with his own 2 hands. It leaned a little. Its paint was peeling, but like everything else on my farm, it was solid and paid for. The real work began inside that barn. For the next several months, the Massey 300 became my obsession. Every evening after my chores were done, every weekend, I was in that barn, wrenches in hand. The first thing I did was get the sparrows out of the auger and clean out a decade's worth of mouse nests, caked dirt, and solidified grease. The smell was overpowering. Then I turned my attention to the engine, the Perkins 6.3 diesel. It was a legendary motor, known for its reliability, but this one was in a sorry state. I pulled the valve cover, and my heart sank. It was filled with a milky, sludgy mess. Water had gotten in. That meant a blown head gasket, at best, or a cracked block, at worst. There was no way around it. The head had to come off. I spent a week just trying to get the manifold bolts loose. I soaked them in penetrating oil, heated them with a torch until they glowed cherry red, and leaned on a 4-foot breaker bar until I thought my spine would snap. Each bolt came free with a gunshot crack that echoed through the quiet barn. When I finally lifted the heavy cast-iron cylinder head off with my engine hoist, the truth was laid bare. 2 of the cylinders were filled with rusty water. The cylinder walls were pitted and scored. This was the point where any sane man would have given up and called the scrapyard. Rich Peterson's words about a lawn ornament echoed in my ears. But I wasn't just fixing a machine. I was proving something to myself, and maybe to the ghost of my father. I drained the block, cleaned everything with a wire brush, and took the head to a machine shop in town. They confirmed the head was warped, but salvageable. They could plane it flat and do a valve job for $150. It was a lot of money for me, but it was cheaper than a new head. While the head was at the shop, I tackled the cylinders. I couldn't afford to have the block bored out, so I did the next best thing. I bought a cylinder hone, attached it to my heavy-duty half-inch drill, and spent 2 full days honing the rust and pitting out of those cylinder walls. It was slow, messy work. I used a mixture of diesel fuel and motor oil as a lubricant, and by the time I was done, the crosshatch pattern was visible again. The walls weren't perfect, but they were clean and smooth. I ordered a new gasket set, new piston rings, and new bearings from a supplier I found in the back of a farm journal. The parts arrived in a greasy cardboard box a week later. I installed them with the meticulous care of a surgeon, using a torque wrench on every bolt, checking the clearances with a plastigauge, making sure everything was exactly to spec according to the worn, oil-stained shop manual I'd bought for $5 at a swap meet. The community's scorn was a constant, low hum in the background of my life. At the co-op, men would stop talking when I walked in. At the diner, I'd catch the waitresses whispering. The prevailing wisdom was that Jed Stone had finally lost his mind. He was wasting his time on a piece of junk while the rest of the world was moving forward. They were all talking about the price of corn hitting $3 a bushel, an unheard-of price. They were talking about buying more land, bigger tractors. The bank was handing out money like it was candy, and everyone was taking it. They saw me, covered in grease, driving my old '65 Ford F-100 to the parts store, and they saw a man being left behind by history. The boom years of the late 1970s were a strange time. It felt like a fever had swept through the heartland. The price of corn and soybeans kept climbing, fueled by massive grain sales to the Soviet Union and rampant inflation that was eating away at the dollar. Land that had been worth $500 an acre when my father died was suddenly selling for $2,000, then $3,000. It didn't seem real. Farmers who had been cautious their whole lives were suddenly taking on staggering amounts of debt, convinced the good times would never end. Rich Peterson was the king of this new era. He was no longer just rich. He was Mr. Peterson, a man to be respected. His father's bank used Rich's expanding operation as a showcase. "Look what's possible," Howard Peterson would tell other farmers, gesturing toward Rich's new equipment. "You can't afford not to expand." Rich bought the 2 farms bordering mine, paying top dollar. He tore out the old fence rows and homesteads, creating vast, open fields that his new, bigger equipment could handle more efficiently. He traded in his John Deere 7700, which was only 2 years old, for a brand new 8820 turbo. It was a monster, a rolling factory that could cut an 8-row corn head and had a grain tank big enough to fill a semi-truck. He built a new machine shed, a towering steel structure that dwarfed my old wooden barn. He put up a new grain leg with shiny silver bins that glistened in the sun. He was the embodiment of progress. Meanwhile, I was still in my barn. After reassembling the engine on the Massey, I moved on to the rest of the machine. I methodically worked my way from front to back. I rebuilt the variable speed drive, replacing the worn belts and bearings. I welded patches over the rust holes in the grain tank. I took the entire separator mechanism apart, the straw walkers, the sieves, the tailings elevator, and replaced every worn chain and sprocket. I found the bend in the grain head was worse than I thought. The main auger was warped. I couldn't afford a new one, so I spent a week with a torch, a sledgehammer, and a straight edge, carefully heating and pounding the massive steel tube back into shape. It was brutal, painstaking work. Finally, in the late summer of 1978, nearly 2 years after I'd dragged it home, the day came. I filled the fuel tank with fresh diesel, bled the injector lines, and hit the starter. The engine turned over slowly, groaning in protest. It coughed once, twice, then spewed a thick cloud of black smoke that filled the barn. And then it caught. The Perkins diesel roared to life, a rough, clattering sound that was the most beautiful music I had ever heard. It wasn't smooth, and it smoked like a chimney, but it was running. I let it run for an hour, my hand on the valve cover, feeling the steady rhythm of the machine I had brought back from the dead. That fall, I used the Massey 300 to harvest my corn. It was a humbling experience. Rich Peterson was next door with his new 8820, cutting a 30-foot swath, his cab air-conditioned, a stereo playing. He could finish 100 acres before lunch. I was in my open station Massey, eating dust, cutting a 13-foot swathe with my old 4-row corn head. I had breakdowns. A belt snapped, a bearing seized. Each time I'd climb down with my tools, fix it, and get going again. It took me 2 weeks to do what Rich did in 2 days. The whole time, the talk at the diner was about what a fool I was. "Did you see Stone out there on that old relic?" they'd say. "He's falling further behind every day. He's got 160 acres, and he'll die with 160 acres. Rich Peterson will own the whole county by the time he's 40. They were right about one thing. I wasn't getting rich. But at the end of that harvest, when my corn was sold and the dust had settled, I had a realization. My total harvest cost was fuel, a few $100s in parts, and my own sweat. I had no payments. Every dollar of profit was mine. I put it in the bank, paid my property taxes, and bought my seed for the next year. I lived simply. I didn't have a new truck or a fancy house, but I also didn't have the sleepless nights that come with owing the bank $500,000. I was seen as a failure, a relic from a past age who couldn't grasp the new realities of modern agriculture. The gap between my small, debt-free operation and Rich's leveraged empire had become a chasm. He was celebrated on the front page of the county newspaper as Farmer of the Year. I was just the strange guy on the edge of town who kept a pile of junk running. One afternoon, late in 1979, I was at the bank depositing my grain check. Howard Peterson called me into his office. He sat behind his big oak desk, a picture of him and Rich shaking the governor's hand on the wall behind him. "Jed," he said, his voice a mix of pity and frustration, "we need to talk about your future. You're a smart kid, a hard worker, but you're being left in the dust. I'm looking at your account. You have some savings, but it's nothing. Rich is leveraging his assets to build an empire. I'm prepared to offer you a line of credit, $250,000. We can get you a new tractor, a new combine. You can buy that 80 acres north of you that's coming up for sale. Prices are only going one way, son. Up." I looked at him, at his tailored suit and his soft hands. "Mr. Peterson," I said respectfully, "I appreciate the offer, but my father always told me, don't ever bet the farm, because one day you'll lose." He sighed and leaned back in his leather chair. "Your father was a good man, Jed, but he was from a different time. The rules have changed." As I left the bank, I picked up a copy of the Des Moines Register from the counter. There was a small article buried on page 12, something I almost missed. It was about the new chairman of the Federal Reserve, a man named Paul Volcker. It said he was determined to break the back of inflation, no matter the cost. It mentioned something about raising interest rates. I didn't understand all the financial jargon, but a cold knot formed in the pit of my stomach. It was the same feeling a farmer gets when he sees a dark green, anvil-shaped cloud forming on the western horizon on a hot July afternoon. Something was coming. Meanwhile, out on the edge of town, a fleet of construction trucks was breaking ground on a new house for Rich Peterson. It was a massive, sprawling ranch-style home on a hill overlooking the fields he now owned, all of them bought and paid for with his father's money. The foundation they were pouring looked big enough for a castle, another monument to a future that seemed, to everyone but me, absolutely certain. The summer of 1980 started with a suffocating, brassy heat that felt different. The sky was a pale, washed-out blue, and the winds that blew up from the south were like the breath from a blast furnace. By July, the corn in my fields, which should have been shoulder-high and a deep, glossy green, was stunted and pale, its leaves rolling up tight during the day to try and save what little moisture they had. The rains had simply stopped. The ground cracked open in patterns that looked like a shattered plate, and the ponds on the back side of my property shrank, their edges turning into a crust of dried, grey mud. It was the same all over the county. The talk at the co-op was no longer about expansion and record profits. It was a low, worried murmur about the drought. But there was another, more sinister whisper that had started. The grain embargo. President Carter had slammed the door on sales to the Soviets, and just like that, our biggest customer was gone. The bottom fell out of the market. Corn that had been trading at over $3 a bushel was suddenly struggling to fetch $2. The first real sign of trouble I saw was on Rich Peterson's face. I ran into him at the parts store one blistering afternoon. He was at the counter, his voice tight with anger, arguing with the manager about the bill for a set of custom-made hydraulic lines for his 8820 combine. His usual smug confidence was gone, replaced by a brittle defensive edge. His clean boots were scuffed, and there were dark circles under his eyes. He saw me, gave a curt, dismissive nod, and turned back to his argument. He was paying with a credit card, something I'd never seen a farmer do at the parts store before. We always ran a tab and settled up after harvest. That fall, the crisis came to a head. The drought had crippled the yield, and the low prices meant what little we did, harvest was barely worth the fuel it took to get it out of the field. I watched Rich's operation from my fence line. He was running his big equipment day and night, pushing it hard, trying to make up for the poor crop with sheer volume from his thousands of acres. He had 2 brand-new semi-trucks hauling grain to his massive new bins, a constant parade of diesel and dust. Then, one afternoon, the parade stopped. I was out on my Massey, chugging along in a cloud of dust, when I saw it. The John Deere 8820, Rich's pride and joy, was sitting silent in the middle of a half-harvested cornfield. A plume of white smoke, or maybe steam, was drifting from its engine compartment. I finished my row, shut down the old Perkins diesel, and watched. A service truck from the John Deere dealership, a full 60 miles away, arrived a few hours later. It was still there when the sun went down. The next day, the combine hadn't moved. The story at the diner was that the turbo had failed, sending shrapnel through the entire engine. It was a catastrophic failure. The engine block was ruined. A new one would have to be ordered from the factory in Moline. The cost, they whispered, was over $20,000, and it would take at least 2 weeks to get the parts and install them, if they were lucky. 2 weeks in the middle of harvest is an eternity. Every day that corn stood in the field, it was at the mercy of the weather, of the deer, of the wind that could shell it out onto the ground. Rich was in a panic. He tried to hire a custom harvester, but with the whole state in a drought, they were all booked solid. He was losing thousands of dollars a day. His father, Howard, was out at the field with him. their argument carrying on the wind, two sharp, angry voices cutting through the quiet hum of the cicadas. The foundation of their empire, built on the idea that new and bigger was always better, was cracking right down the middle. My old Massey, meanwhile, just kept running. One morning, the main drive belt for the separator started to squeal. I shut it down, pulled a spare belt I kept in my toolbox, a standard size I could buy at any auto parts store for $20, and had it replaced in under an hour. I was back in the field before the dew had burned off the stubble. The final blow came not from the sky or the fields, but from the mail. It arrived in a plain white envelope from the Farmers and Merchants Bank of Howard Peterson. It was a notice that the interest rate on all operating loans, which were tied to the prime rate, was being adjusted. The prime rate, which had been in the single digits when these men had signed their lives away, had just crested 20%. 20%. It was a death sentence, and everyone knew it. It meant that a farmer who owed $500,000, a common enough figure for an operation the size of Rich's, was now paying $100,000 a year in interest alone, before he even touched the principal. You couldn't make that kind of money farming. You couldn't make half that. The fever had broken, and the cold reality of the morning after was setting in. The winter of 1981 was the quietest I can ever remember. The usual optimism that follows a harvest, the talk of next year's plans, was gone. It was replaced by a heavy, oppressive silence. The lights in farmhouses started going out, not just for the night, but for good. Little hand-painted foreclosure signs, tacked to fence posts by grim-faced sheriff's deputies, became a common sight on the gravel roads. They were like little white tombstones for family legacies that had lasted for generations. The Peterson Empire, which had seemed so invincible just a year before, collapsed with shocking speed. Rich's massive operating loan, with its new 21% interest rate, was a beast that could no longer be fed. The dealership repossessed the broken 8820 Combine right out of his machine shed. The two new semi-trucks were next. He tried to sell off some of the land he'd bought, but the market had evaporated. No one was buying. Land that he'd paid $3,000 an acre for, he couldn't get $1,000 for now. Howard Peterson, the man who had preached the gospel of leverage, was trapped. Federal bank examiners were crawling all over his books, questioning the massive, under-collateralized loans he had made, especially the ones to his own son. He was facing the ruin of his bank and the loss of his reputation. He had no choice. He had to foreclose on his own son. I remember the day of the auction. It was a cold, grey day in March of 1982. The wind had a bitter edge to it, rattling the bare branches of the oak trees in the yard. The auction was held at Rich's new house, the sprawling mansion on the hill. It was never finished. The windows were boarded up with plywood, and the yard was a sea of frozen mud and construction debris. It looked like a monument to a forgotten king. The crowd was different from the one at the Miller auction 6 years earlier. The mood wasn't optimistic. It was somber, almost funereal. These were men watching their own potential fate play out before their eyes. They were here to pick over the bones of a fallen neighbor, hoping to find a bargain that might help them survive another year. Rich was there, standing off to the side with his wife. He looked like a ghost. He'd lost a lot of weight, and his expensive coat hung on him like a scarecrow's. The arrogance was gone, replaced by a hollow, defeated look. His father was nowhere to be seen. I wasn't there to gloat. I felt a profound sadness. Rich had been arrogant, but he was also a product of his time, a believer in a dream that had turned into a nightmare. He'd flown too close to the sun, and his wings, built of debt and easy credit, had melted. My operation, by contrast, was an island of stability. The drought had hurt me, yes, but my costs were so low I had still managed to turn a small profit. I had no debt payments. The 21% interest rate that was strangling my neighbors meant nothing to me. The money I had saved over the years, the money Howard Peterson had called nothing, was now a powerful tool in a world where cash was king. I could pay my taxes, buy my seed, and fix my equipment without asking anyone for a dime. My old Massey 300 sat in the barn, its faded paint a testament to a philosophy that had been ridiculed, but was now proving to be the only one that worked. That winter, my neighbors started coming to me. Not for money, but for help. A man's planter would break down, and he couldn't afford the dealership's shop rate. He'd come to my farm, and we'd work on it together in my barn, using my welder and my tools. Another man's tractor had an engine knock, and we'd pull the oil pan and replace the bearings ourselves. My farm became a sort of community repair shop. They stopped calling me the guy with the junk combine. Now they just called me Jed, and they said it with a newfound respect. They saw that my wealth wasn't in my bank account. It was in my hands, in my ability to keep old iron running when the new, shiny stuff had failed. I was surviving, and in that time and place, survival was the only victory that mattered. The auctioneer started with the household goods, the unfinished kitchen cabinets, the brand new appliances still in their boxes. Then they moved to the tools in the giant machine shed, snap-on tool chests, welders, air compressors, the best money could buy. I bought a heavy-duty floor jack and a set of 1.5-inch drive sockets for 10 cents on the dollar. Then came the land. They sold it off in 80-acre parcels. The crowd was quiet. The bids were low and hesitant. This wasn't a feeding frenzy. It was a wake. When the parcel came up that bordered my own farm to the north, the original Peterson homestead, the place where Rich had grown up before his father got into banking, I stepped forward. The auctioneer started the bidding at $500 an acre. A year ago, it would have started at $3,000. There was a long silence. Finally, a speculator from Des Moines bid $510. $525, I said. My voice was steady. It carried in the cold air. The speculator looked at me, then at the land. He shook his head and dropped out. No one else made a move. The auctioneer chanted his rhythm, his voice devoid of its usual energy. "Sold," he said, his gavel falling with a dull thud. To Jed Stone. I bought the 80 acres for less than I had in my savings account. I paid for it right there, with a check drawn on an account that was entirely my own. As I walked away from the clerk's table, I passed Rich. He wouldn't look at me. He just stared at the ground, his shoulders slumped. I stopped. "Rich," I said. He looked up, his eyes filled with a mixture of shame and resentment. "What do you want, Stone? Come to rub it in?" "No," I said quietly. "I came to offer you a job. I need help on my place, and now I've got another 80 acres to work, and I'll rent your folks' old house back to you. For $1 a year. Your family has been on that piece of ground for 100 years. It ought to stay that way." He stared at me, his mouth slightly open. He didn't understand. He was expecting vengeance, a final humiliation. He wasn't prepared for grace. Tears welled up in his eyes, the first crack in the dam of his pride. He just nodded, unable to speak, and turned away. The years that followed were lean, but they were good. The farm crisis slowly loosened its grip on the heartland. Prices stabilized, and the rains returned. I farmed my original 160 acres and the 80 I'd bought from Rich. I farmed it all with the same equipment I'd always had. My old Ford tractor, my Chevy grain truck, and of course, the Massey 300. Rich worked for me for 2 years. He was a changed man, quiet and hard-working. He learned how to weld, how to rebuild a carburetor, how to listen to an engine and know what was wrong with it. He learned the things his father's money had never let him learn. After 2 years, he saved up enough to move his family to a small town in Minnesota where his wife had family, and he got a job as a mechanic at a tractor dealership. He was happier, I think, than he ever was when he was king of the county. My reputation in the community was cemented. I was no longer the eccentric fool. I was the man who had been right all along. Men twice my age would stop me at the co-op to ask my opinion on whether they should buy a piece of equipment or fix their old one. The talk at the diner changed. They didn't talk about getting rich anymore. They talked about getting by, about being smart, about staying out of the bank. The lessons had been hard won, paid for with the deeds to farms and the dissolution of dreams. I never got rich. I never built a giant machine shed or a fancy house, but I expanded, slowly and deliberately. When a neighboring farm came up for sale, I'd buy it, but only when I could pay cash. By the time I was 50, I owned 500 acres, all of it free and clear. I eventually married a schoolteacher from town, and we had a son. I named him Thomas, after my father. When he was old enough, I'd take him out to the barn, just like my dad had done with me. I taught him how to change the oil, how to set the points on a distributor, how to tell by the color of the smoke what a diesel engine needed. One warm autumn afternoon, when Tom was about 16, we were out in the cornfield. He was driving the grain truck, and I was in the cab of the Massey 300. It was nearly 30 years old by then, its red paint almost completely gone, replaced by a patchwork of primer and the patina of rust. But it ran like a top. Every bearing, every belt, every chain had been replaced by my own 2 hands over the decades. I knew its every sound, its every vibration. It was a part of me. We finished the last row and pulled up next to each other, the setting sun casting long shadows across the stubble. Tom climbed out of the truck and walked over to the combine. He put his hand on the fender, just as I had done all those years ago at the auction. "Dad," he said, "some of the guys at school were giving me a hard time. They said we're the only farm in the county still using a combine this old. They asked why you don't just buy a new one." I shut down the old Perkins engine, and the sudden silence of the evening settled around us. I looked at him. My son, the future of this land. I thought of my father, of Rich Peterson, of the long journey that had brought me to this moment. "Tom," I said, climbing down from the operator's platform, "let me tell you something. This machine isn't just a combine, it's a lesson. It taught me that real wealth isn't about having the newest or the biggest. It's about owning what you have. It's about freedom. Every time that engine starts, it's the sound of freedom. It's the sound of not owing any man a single dime. Other people, they buy a new combine with a bank loan, and they don't own it. The bank owns it, and the bank owns them. We own this. It might be old and it might be slow, but it's ours. And because of that, everything you see," I said, sweeping my hand across the fields glowing gold in the twilight, "all of this is ours too. Never forget that." He looked from the old combine to the endless fields, and I saw in his eyes that he understood. He was seeing not a pile of old iron, but a legacy, a story of survival, of patience, and of the quiet wisdom that is sometimes found in the things the world has chosen to forget. The wind rustled the dry husks in the field, a sound like a soft whisper, and in that moment I knew my father's lessons would live on.